So today I want to talk about the 4 R's of herbicide use. You may have heard of the 4 R's of fertilizer use, but I'm going to repurpose that for herbicide applications. Today we're going to talk about applying the right herbicides at the right time, at the right place, and at the right rate. So first, let's talk about selecting the right herbicide for our job. Um, Really, when you're choosing a herbicide, what you want to know is each product's capabilities and limitations. What weeds are being controlled, the use rate for your particular weed, your particular setting, your particular crop, any crop injury potential you might have, any types of rotational restrictions, and other special precautions. Also, note that while some weed species may not be on the label, you can use extension and other resources to confirm if a product may be effective. Another thing about choosing your herbicides is, are you going for more selective application or non-selective applications? For example, remember products like 2,4-D, Select Max, or Clethodim are selective products. 2,4-D is only going to harm broadleaf weeds, while products like Clethodim are only going to harm grass weeds versus your non-selective products, which are going to give you complete control of pretty much everything. Products like gramoxone and glyphosate or Roundup. Now, with selectivity, it can be herbicide based and it can also be crop based. Most of us are already familiar with herbicide tolerant traits in crops, and there have been several on the market these past 20, 30 years. Most of us are familiar with like the Roundup Ready varieties. Um, Liberty Link came out several years ago as well. And we're also looking at some of the sulfonylurea tolerant systems, things that are tolerant to the ALS inhibitors like halosulfuron. Nowadays, we have more of these stacked traits where we can, like the Roundup Ready Liberty Link systems, where we can spray both glyphosate and glufosinate products post-emergence. The Enlist products allow us to spray Enlist 1, glyphosate, and glufosinate. Also, recently coming out is the Roundup Ready to Extend system, which we can use now with the newer formulated over-the-top dicamba products, allowing us again to spray glyphosate, dicamba, and glufosinate at once. Other herbicide tolerance traits also include like the Liberty Link GT27 system, which allows us to spray glyphosate products, glufosinate products, as well as the group 27 herbicides like isoxaflutol, and the MGI beans, which allow us to spray glufosinate, mesotrione, and isoxaflutol. So with all those herbicide tolerance traits, one thing that's really helpful for herbicide applications is tank mixing. So with tank mixing, you have several benefits, one of them being increased efficacy and cost savings. This allow you to consolidate, hopefully, multiple herbicide applications into one, and it reduces the number of trips required through a field, which saves you fuel, labor, and equipment mileage. And it's often more cost and time effective than applying all individual herbicides at different times. Next is the benefit of having that enhanced weed control spectrum. See, this practice allows for a broader spectrum of pest control and allows for the management of multiple target species or pests at the same time. In some instances with this, synergism can also occur where that mixture improves the efficacy beyond what each individual herbicide brings to the table separately. And it's beneficial for resistance management because it's a valuable tool in preventing or slowing the development of resistant weed populations. And research does indicate that mixing different herbicide sites of action is a lot more effective at delaying herbicide resistance than simply just rotating herbicides from year to year. But crop injury can increase with some of these tank mixtures. And compatibility and mixing order do matter when you're mixing multiple products. So with mixing order, what you want to do is first you want to put your any dry material, wettable powders into the tank. Then you want to agitate that. Water and wettable powders, agitate thoroughly. Then you want to add any microencapsulated suspensions, followed by liquid flowables and suspensions, followed by emulsible concentrate formulations, followed by your glyphosate formulations, then your surfactants. And all while doing this, you do want to maintain that constant agitation because, again, dry herbicide materials do fall out of solution rather quickly. And if you're tank mixing herbicides, you always want to follow the restrictions on the most restrictive label. So let's talk about selecting the right time. Well, as far as weeds goes, your control timings and methods are really based on the life cycle of the type of weed you're trying to control. For example, especially with these post-emergence applications, annual weeds you want to control when they're young and actively growing. A lot of times you can apply both a pre and a post to control these weeds. With biennial weeds, it's a little bit hard. You may be able to control it with a pre-application, but you still want to control it when it's young, actively growing, or most importantly, in that rosette stage before that biennial weed starts to bolt. For perennial weeds, you're not going to get any control out of a pre-emergence step. You're not going to get any control for an established perennial with a pre-emergence herbicide. In general, you want to look at applying your post at the early budding to flowering stage, and most perennial weeds are more effectively controlled with a fall herbicide application. Now, when we talk about timing and controlling weeds, I have to mention this thing called the critical period for weed control. This graph just shows an example of the weed competition and weed-free periods in corn. And by critical weed-free period, I mean this is the minimum length of time after planting or after crop establishment that the crop should be kept weed-free in order to avoid yield reduction from weed competition. So if we look at the orange line, the weed-free portion of this graph, we just say that farmer X keeps their corn weed-free for just 5 weeks. And that farmer is going to see only about 60% of what he would have gotten for his yield. Likewise, if we look at the weed competition or this blue line, that corn can only compete for about 2 weeks before we see a decline in yield. So in these cases, the longer that we maintain our crops weed-free, the higher our yield potential is. So for the best results, in general, you really want to keep your corn and your soybean weed-free before the V4 stage. At that point, crops can usually compete better with weeds, and you're not going to really see that yield lag. So in order to keep our fields weed-free, we need to build a foundation on our residual herbicides. It's not only protects our yields, it also reduces that pressure we might have to make from late post-emergence applications. So again, residual herbicides are the foundation of these programs, and in many cases, the goal is to start clean. If you're in a conventional tillage system, applying those residual herbicides as soon as possible after you've tilled your field, after planting. If you're in a no-till system, you want to apply those residual herbicides pretty soon after that pre-plant burn down treatment. So please note that that residual herbicide clock starts at application. Once you apply that pre-emergence residual herbicide, you're only probably going to get maybe 3 to 5 weeks of residual control before another herbicide application is needed. So if you were to apply your residual herbicides 2 or 3 weeks before planting with your burn down or your pre-plant application, that residual herbicide is not going to last you very long you plant your crop, and another herbicide application is going to be needed a lot sooner. Now, with residual herbicides, they are weather dependent and activation is non-negotiable. So when residual herbicides are applied, really what happens is they sit on the soil surface and won't be effective until some type of rainfall or irrigation event pushes that herbicide down into the soil where it can be effective. That rainfall also puts the herbicide into the soil solution where weeds can take it up. In general, it takes about a half an inch of water within 5 to 7 days of application to activate most of these residual herbicides. However, some early spring applications can wait a little bit longer for activation compared to later spring applications because with the early spring, most weeds haven't started to germinate yet. Also, with the water, it does provide enough moisture for consistent residual activity. Even after activation, extended dry periods can reduce performance because herbicides become less available as soil is dry due to binding or absorption. So weeds germinating under dry conditions may escape. And again, activation requirements can differ among different pre-emergence residual herbicides. For example, products like atrazine, Prowl, Valor, and Zidua need over 0.75 inches to activate, whereas other herbicides like Callisto, Metribuzin, and Outlook only need about 0.33 inches of water to activate. Also, again, these pre-emergence herbicides don't necessarily last the same amount of time. With atrazine, for example, you're getting about 4 or 5 weeks of residual control versus Callisto, which will only give you about 2 to 4 weeks of residual control. And also be aware that not all pre-emergence herbicides are equal in their levels of control. Here we see a table of group 15 herbicides, Dual Magnum, Outlook, Warrant, and Zidua, as well as some of the different grass species they control. Note that all of these products are very effective against barnyard grass. None of these products are effective against Bermuda grass. These products are also very effective against crabgrass and foxtail. But when we look at our panicum species, fall panicum and Texas panicum, Zidua is a whole lot better at controlling fall panicum compared to Dual. And Zidua is also slightly better at controlling Texas panicum compared to the other products. Now, unfortunately, with these residual herbicides and trying to time it with our pre-emergence application before we have to apply a post-emergence application, it can get a little complicated, especially considering that we have multiple weed species in a field, and not all of these weeds may be germinating at once. Now, for example, with horseweed or mare's tail, you're looking at the species germinating at 2 different periods in the year, with a peak germination in April, kind of fading off through May. Something like Palmer amaranth is going to germinate throughout the entire growing season from April to October, or something like common ragweed that is going to germinate a little bit earlier in the growing season, then taper off later in the summer. So what are some methods we can use to kind of capture that residual activity and still control most of the weeds in our field? So kind of what we want, a good strategy is to really extend that residual control. So we apply our pre-emergence herbicide. That's going to give us a couple weeks of control. And then we want to try apply our post-emergence herbicide and include a residual herbicide like dual, like Zidua, with that post-effective herbicide like glyphosate or glufosinate. So one strategy is to, maybe consider different types of pre-emergence applications. So there's early pre-plant applications, which can help spread the workload and improve activation chances. Now, those early pre-plant applications would be the ones closer to your burn down treatments. However, again, with those early pre-plant applications, you might see your residual herbicide run out earlier if planting is delayed or that application is too far ahead of peak weed germination. Then you have your at planting application, your common residual application right as soon as you plant or maybe within 24 hours right after. Now, this better aligns with that residual application and that first flush, hopefully, of those summer annual weeds. But those pre-applications does still depend on activation. There's also the delayed pre or early post applications. You may be able to wait 1 or 2 weeks before applying that residual herbicide. That can help extend that residual control, especially if you're starting clean and you're not seeing a lot of rainfall right after planting. However, weeds that do emerge before application can create that early season competition, and those options for delayed pre, early post do tend to narrow once that crop emerges. Now, talked about tank mixing before, but tank mixing is especially beneficial with these delayed pre, early post applications because that tank mix can catch weeds that not only escaped earlier applications, but again, you're pairing that residual activity with that foliar activity of the herbicides. And again, you're working to improve resistance management and delay the onset of herbicide-resistant weeds. One of the things that I've looked at over the past couple of years and noticed that a lot of these newer herbicide products, especially these premix products, can provide very effective season-long control if they're applied as a delayed pre-application. For example, last year we looked at the following products: Sure Start, Acuron, and Storin applied pre-emergence right at corn planting or at the V4 stage. So what we saw, for example, with common lamb's quarters, with our Sure Start application, there really was no significant difference in whether we applied it pre-emergence or at the V4 stage. The same thing occurred with our application of Acuron, Storin, and Sure Start plus atrazine. So we started clean and we were able to delay that herbicide application to the V4 stage, and it pretty much gave us season-long weed control of common lamb's quarters. And with that timing, just applying it either pre or V4, we didn't really see a drop in yield or a significant difference in our corn yield, with all of our treatments yielding higher than our untreated check. Another tank mix study I did last year was one that looked at applying combinations of Reflex, Enlist One, and Dual Magnum to control glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth. So in this study, we looked at Palmer amaranth density or plants per square meter at 7 days after application. Most of our products controlled Palmer amaranth pretty well. Saw a little bit higher number of Palmer amaranth with reflex and reflex plus dual, but all treatments that contained enlist or reflex plus enlist pretty much didn't have any Palmer amaranth in those plots. And by 21 days after application, we did see an increase in Palmer amaranth density with reflex, again, which didn't control it as effectively as others at 7 weeks. And we saw a little bit of increase with Palmer amaranth with Enlist 1. Again, Enlist 1 is just 2,4-D. It doesn't provide any residual control. But our Reflex Plus Enlist treatments and our Reflex Plus Enlist plus dual treatments still had no Palmer in those plots. Please note that Reflex and dual magnum do provide a little bit of residual control. So again, we're not only relying on that effective post-emergence herbicide, but we're also incorporating that residual herbicide to continue that activity throughout the growing season. But even with tank mixes, weed size and crop stage do matter. For most of our post-emergence herbicides, our recommendation is usually less than 3-inch weeds, no bigger than 4-inch weeds. So if the weeds are bigger than a soda can, your herbicide, they're probably too big to spray. And also note that herbicide labels do have restrictions on when they can be applied as far as growth stages in corn. For example, atrazine's great herbicide. You can apply it pre and you can apply it up to the 12-inch. You can apply it up to 12-inch corn. There are a lot of good pre-emergence products that have atrazine in them. Acuron, which I mentioned earlier, is one of those products. So you can apply Acuron pre, or you can apply Acuron early post, but you cannot apply Acuron if that corn gets too big. With post-emergent soybean herbicides, things like glufosinate, 2,4-D or Enlist, you cannot apply those herbicides after the R1 stage of soybeans, even if you're dealing with like the Enlist soybean system or a tolerant soybean system. So with contact herbicides, coverage is the key because contact herbicides, they are only going to affect the weeds, the parts of the plants that they touch. For example, these two pictures of Palmer amaranth in the top right-hand corner and the left corner, the small seedling, glufosinate is going to control that just fine. Might have a little bit more difficult controlling the picture in the bottom left here because we've got more growing points. But if you're applying a contact herbicide in a situation like this, the weed coverage is just too dense. There are too many growing points on these plants to effectively control it. Now, with systemic herbicides like glyphosate and 2,4-D, absorption and translocation is the key. Herbicides like 2,4-D are going to be less effective on large weeds because mature plants have much thicker, waxier cuticles that prevent absorption, and they have higher metabolic rates that can degrade the herbicide before it kills the plant. Large weeds also possess extensive established root systems and developed vascular tissues that helps prevent the herbicide from translocating to the growing points which allows the plants to recover. But if a plant is stressed, those herbicides are also not going to work as effectively because those systemic herbicides are going to move with all the food and the nutrients in the plant. And if the plant isn't effectively moving those nutrients because it's too hot or perspiring too much, it's not going to be as effective, or it's not going to flow as effectively. So weeds, again, weed size matters. Something like this, targeting weeds at the seedling stage with either a contact or a systemic herbicide is great. Something like this, no, not going to be very effective. Again, those plants are too big, too many growing points to have to control. And something like this, definitely not. That palmer has already produced seed. Spraying is not going to do anything to prevent that plant from dropping its seed and coming back next year. Plus, it's too late in the growth stage of the soybeans to spray. And even tank mixes don't work as well on big weeds. The bigger and older the weed, the harder it is to kill. For example, here we have a trial I did several years ago looking at applying Roundup plus 2,4-D combinations or Roundup plus Liberty combinations to common ragweed that was already too big, either 6 to 12 inches or 14 to 18 inches. Now, those tank mix products worked great. We're still working great when common ragweed was 6 to 12 inches, but when that ragweed got to be about 14 to 18 inches tall, you can see there is a definite decrease in the efficacy of these tank mix products. Next, I'll talk about selecting the right rate. So, labeling. The specified label rate is critical for the herbicide to work as intended. This is done both to minimize crop injury and ensure safety, and reduce resistance and weed escapes that look like resistance. Also, labeling protects human health and prevents illegal pesticide residues, and it's the law. You have to follow the label. So when we talk about labeling in terms of herbicide resistance mitigation. So just a quick review, and for those of you who don't know how weeds become resistant to herbicides, what happens is you're applying a single herbicide, say glyphosate, over time. In your field, a very small number of weeds in the populations are going to be naturally resistant to certain herbicides. When you use that same herbicide, it controls almost all of those weeds in the populations, except those resistant ones. Those resistant survivors grow, reproduce, and produce more resistant weeds over time. So applying herbicides with the same mode of action repeatedly enables that resistant population to multiply. And it's not just applying the same herbicide over and over. You can get resistance from what we call sublethal doses. So it's important to understand that herbicide rate and weed size are not independent. If a label says 20 ounces of a product is required to kill a weed and do not apply more than 20 ounces in a single application, then 20 ounces is the correct rate for the correct growth stage. So applying a sublethal dose, say applying a 20 ounce rate to a weed that is 10 inches tall, can, again, apply that sublethal dose it allows some individuals to survive and reproduce, again, increasing that potential for resistance over time. What it does, it causes more selection pressure. It's going to still kill the most sensitive individuals and leaving those with natural tolerance to that herbicide around. Those sublethal doses can also produce what we call a hormetic effect, where those low doses actually stimulate growth and increase biomass and seed production of that weed. Also, sublethal doses can lead to rapid evolution, which those has been shown that repeated applications of sublethal rates of certain herbicides, for example, Italian-resistant ryegrass to the group 1 or the ACC ACE inhibitors, that rapid evolution with those sublethal doses can lead to resistance within fewer generations. So you lose the ability to use that herbicide a lot sooner than you would if you had just applied that herbicide at that full rate. So in order to minimize those sublethal rates, there's some precautions you want to take. First, don't cut your rates. Always use the recommended label rate for your particular weed for that particular size. Also, you want to choose your rates based on your hardest to control weeds present. Some weeds are a lot easier to control than others. And you also want to calibrate and maintain your equipment. Make sure you're getting the right rate and your output is where it needs to be. Also, you want to make sure you're using the correct adjuvants when required or as recommended on the label. These adjuvants are going to improve herbicide uptake and performance, especially under some challenging conditions like, stress. And it's also going to reduce the chance that weeds only get a partial dose of these herbicides. You also want to, you still want to apply these herbicides in conditions that favor herbicide activity. If you're applying a post-emergence herbicide on a day like today where the potential high is 90 degrees, it's just not going to be as effective. And you still want to use multiple modes of action, multiple herbicide groups, but be sure to avoid antagonistic tank mixtures or programs that may encourage you to use reduced rates. Even with tank mixes, you still want to use those full labeled rates. And last, I want to mention a little bit about selecting the right place. Now, most of us know what we're going to plant, what we're going to spray, corn, soybeans, whatever crop we're interested in keeping weed free. But for this talk, I just want to mention that there are other ways to keep herbicides on target, whether you use something like this hooded sprayer, or you calibrate your sprayers to make a banded application between the rows and not necessarily spraying the crop directly. Technology, of course, has come a long way in the past several years with technology that also allows us to, locate the weeds in the field and spray just those weeds. Here's an example of a video I got from Travis Ford, our ag agent in Caroline County, of a See and Spray system. And in this system, you can see that boom turning on and off when it senses a weed. But targeted applications like this are only effective with good practices and a good residual program. It doesn't do us any good if our field is completely weedy to use a targeted sprayer, because those nozzles are just going to be on constantly, and we're not really saving any money or reducing herbicide output. Also, with applying the herbicides in the right place, we really need to start being cognizant of endangered species in our area. Newer product labels are going to actually require you to go to the Bulletins Live website and download a spray bulletin. Downloading a bulletin from Bulletins Live 2 is actually rather simple. So, for example, if you go to the Bulletins Live 2 website, click on Bulletins Live 2, it gives you the option of entering your farm, your intended application month, as well as your EPA registration number for the product you intend to apply. However, a lot of that really isn't that necessary with some of the updates that have been made to Bulletins Live 2. Really, all you have to do is kind of zoom into your farm or zoom into your desired application area. Hopefully, hopefully not wait as long for a bulletin to pull up. But anyway, what that's going to do is it's going to take you to, once those bulletins load, what you're going to see is you're going to see like a pink area. And once you click on that pink area, that little button is going to turn green. And once that button turns green, it's going to give you the option of downloading a printable bulletin that looks something like this. So you can see kind of the red endangered species protection areas or pesticide use limitation areas here. Now, when you click on those areas and get a bulletin, it's not just going to give you the bulletin for a single product. It's going to give you the bulletin for every product in that pesticide use limitation area. So it's always good to just, visit Bulletins Live 2 every year, at least 6 months before you intend to make that herbicide application or any type of pesticide application, just to see if there are any restrictions or any problems you might see forthcoming. And with Bulletins Live 2, it is, of course, part of the Endangered Species Act mitigation. This is coming with newer product labels, and as products get re-registered, there are going to be restrictions with, runoff, spray drift, as well as Bulletins Live 2. For runoff, you're going to have to acquire a certain number of runoff mitigation points. The QR codes on the screen will take you to those handy dandy runoff and spray drift mitigation calculators. And if you're looking for other resources as far as weed control goes, the 2026 Mid-Atlantic Weed Guide is available. This is a great resource. We talk about weed control in corn, sorghum, soybeans, small grains, as well as pasture and CRP ground. A great deal. Just a PDF of this guide is going to cost you $8, $15 if you're someone who likes to carry around something like this in your truck, or for just $5 more, you can get both a PDF for your phone, tablet, PC, or a printed copy for your truck. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. And Emily, do I have any questions?